Wow. And of course, during that.
Okay.
Okay.
Let me just move my stuff here. Did you need a seat? What's that? Did you need a seat?
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We will have a hybrid presentation on the book No Pasarán, Anti-Fascist Dispatches from a World in Crisis. Through Zoom, we have our comrade Shane Burley, an author, filmmaker, and union organizer based in Portland, Oregon. He is the author of Why We Fight, essays on fascism, resistance, and surviving the apocalypse, and fascism today, what it is and how to end it. And the editor of No Pasarán. On the book, he will be presenting Anti-Fascist Dispatches from a World in Crisis. And in person, we have Michael Novick of Anti-Racist Action LA and People Against Racist Terror, who talks about anti-racist work and dismantling colonialism. Thank you all. Thank you both.
Thanks, everyone. Can folks see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to come. Big thanks to Michael for doing this with me, and for working on the book together. So I think we wanted to have sort of like a back and forth conversation with Michael and I, and then invite folks if they have questions, maybe like halfway through or so, to throw them out or to spark discussion or give comments, that kind of thing. I was just going to talk for a couple of minutes about where the book came from. And it came from a series of conversations when I was going around sort of doing book events for Fascism Today and talking with comrades, particularly folks from the Black Rose Anarchist Federation and other folks about, what we liked about the conversation around anti-fascism that was happening then. People were kind of reviving the history. They were talking about tactics, things like that. But there was a lot that we kind of sort of didn't like about what was taking place. And that was mainly that it was super, super narrow. What we talked about when we said anti-fascism was a very narrow kind of subcultural white social movement of a very, very small slice of the history. And what this necessarily does is it gives a false presentation of what anti-fascism is. It tells it that it's coming out of this one particular history, these one particular communities, that it fights one particular type of the far right, and that doesn't reflect reality. So we wanted, in conversation, to figure out how can we kind of raise up just different voices. So we wanted to talk about demographic movements that are basically not covered in so much of the anti-fascist literature that has come out. We wanted to break out of the subcultural mode. There's obviously chapters in the book that talk specifically about subcultures, but they're not always the same subculture. They're not the same communities, and they're drawing from radically different histories. We also wanted to break out of the kind of American-centric mold and talk more internationally, because how these social movements play out is simply different internationally. And we're talking about different far right, different tactics, basically everything different. And then obviously tactically different. We wanted to break out of just this one model of anti-fascism. We wanted to think about different ways that these movements have formed and what's more effective, because the reality is that the way we talk about anti-fascism in 2017 and 2018 will be almost obsolete today, next year, the year after, because these movements change, we change, how politics organizes itself changes. So I wanted to kind of work backward by getting kind of a unified definition of anti-fascism, and that's what's introduction. It's basically a conversation about what do we even mean when we say anti-fascism. And the key point that I make in there, and we can also talk about this, and I think Michael will have thoughts on this, is that anti-fascism is a way of fighting fascism or the far right that does not rely on the state. It assumes the state is not an arbitrary force to protect human rights, but the state is sort of the crystallized coercive method of capital. And that something to be anti-fascism means that we come together as a social movement to confront it. And there's a lot of governments that will say that their official policy is anti-fascism. The America's policy during World War II was on paper anti-fascist, but we don't mean the same thing when we say that. We mean something totally different. Likewise, it's also a social movement, often uses the tactic of no platforming or the strategic intervention of no platforming, which means basically trying to decimate the far right's ability to operate. That's sort of like the tactic or strategy number one, most of the time, not always, but most of the time. And then it's also necessarily intersectional. And what that means is it goes after different types of far right movements that have different priorities. So traditionally in the US, we go after the Klan on one side, neo-Nazis on the other, but there's other kinds of far right movements that look a little bit differently. So there's kind of male supremacist movements coming out of the manosphere. They look a little bit differently. There's movements that claim to be multiracial, but they're still targeting immigrants or xenophobic. There's obviously a massive transphobic movement that basically has keyed in on trans healthcare as the key issue, or keyed in as schools, and they work slightly different too. So a kind of correct anti-fascist social movement tries to see these different kernels, doesn't expect the far right to look one way every time, and tries to go at it that way. And so the book really tried to reach out past the way we've talked about this before, invite other folks into the conversation, talk about different strategies and histories. And the idea was to sort of redraw the lines of anti-fascism and to draw them much larger and to kind of invite more people into that conversation and to look at those histories and kind of combine them. To say that if you're coming in and looking at one particular history of anti-fascism, it's important to start thinking about these other movements that you might have missed. And so part of that was actually getting histories written in a way that were actually relevant and useful to people. There's a lot of kind of scholarship out there that's been sort of inaccessible, tucked away in the academy. That's not particularly helpful, but what is helpful is histories written by people who are on the ground, who want those histories to be instructive now. And so I thought that would kind of lead us into talking about Michael's chapter, which is really, Michael, it's about your history a little bit. So I thought it might make sense to just talk a little bit about how you were introduced. I guess first, how you came to kind of have consciousness about the far right and the threat the far right presents. But then how were you introduced to anti-fascist organizing? How did it get started for you?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit of a dinosaur. I was born in 1947, so that makes me 76. And, I've lived through a lot of waves of anti-fascism in this country, anti-racist organizing, and have persevered in them. I was raised Orthodox Jewish in Brooklyn, New York, in a working class family. My father was a shop steward in a fairly left-wing union, although my parents might have been vaguely pink, let's say. And my father joined the military during World War II, partly because his citizenship. He was an immigrant from Poland and came over in the 1930s. World War II was very recent memory, in my life, and that includes both, obviously, Hitler's genocide of European Jewry and Roma, gay people, and also U.S. Atomic bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and being raised Orthodox was a very interesting experience because, in a certain way, I was being indoctrinated constantly from two sources. One was sort of Zionism, and the other was, U.S. imperialism and the whitewashed view of history. And in a sense, coming in and living in an immigrant, somewhat European-oriented Orthodox Jewish family insulated me against both of them. And I came out of it as, sort of an anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist, identifying my Jewish identity. And in that era, there were a lot of exposures, particularly about the CIA and its role in controlling social movements in this country and internationally, obviously, but also the fact that the CIA was built out of incorporating the Nazi Secret Service into itself, because the U.S. immediately turned after its alliance with the Soviet Union during World War II into seeing the Soviet Union as its main threat and absorbing a lot of the fascist apparatus in Europe to retain that threat and to try to eliminate the communist forces that were in France, Italy, and elsewhere. And so they collaborated a lot with the former Nazi forces and with organized criminal organizations. I came of age in that era and, lived through the assassination of Malcolm X, the assassination of Edward Everett's assassination of Martin Luther King, and I was a student at Brooklyn College in New York, which when I went there was free. It's a free 4-year public college, part of the City University of New York, or Queens College, Brooklyn College, City College, bunch of others, different community colleges, but they were all white. When I went to Brooklyn College, it was 99% white, and Brooklyn even then was 50% black and Puerto Rican at least. And so I got involved in various struggles against the war in Vietnam, anti-draft, a lot of other things, and for student rights. They eliminated the student government at my college in the 50s when people spoke out against the Korean War. And so we were pushing for having student body elections and a real, right for freedom of speech on a campus. I got involved with SDS. I was the student body president. We had massive support for all that stuff, the anti-war stuff, on campus, student evaluation of teachers, et cetera, et cetera. We had a big strike when they suspended some people for being against the Navy and cops and all. But we turned our attention, it's a very small black student union, 25 and 12,000 students and a dozen Puerto Ricans in the Puerto Rican student union. They said you should be addressing this question. They said SDS and some other left groups, and we started to do it. Our support and student body evaporated. Because people bought all this stuff about, oh, it's going to degrade the academic standard if we admit black and Puerto Rican students to open to college, and impact my brother and sister when we get in. All the arguments are here about affirmative action. So to me, that was an object lesson that unless you're actively engaged in a conscious anti-racist struggle in what you're doing and raising the question of internalized and institutionalized white supremacy, anything else you do is any house your cards. And that organizing in that way had to be the priority of how you approach any organizing, because otherwise it was going to be counterproductive. So from that day to this, basically, I've seen myself as a conscious anti-racist, which does not mean that I'm not racist, but that means I'm struggling with my own internalized racism. 50, 60 years, it's still, it goes deep. But I did see, when we did that work on campus, for example, there was the Young Americans for Freedom exactly on the campus, what became the Jewish Defense Day exactly on the campus. And so if you were doing anti-racist work, it was very clear that it had to be actually also anti-fascist. There was a base of people actively organizing within sectors of particularly white society, and most Jews there, and then voted themselves as white, or fascism, essentially, for repression, for that's how I came to it, and that's been the thread that's carried me through. So over years, I was involved with SDS. I was actually in weather for a brief period, where they were deeper under wasn't needed enough. Those two economies, I was part of the very part of organizing committee in June 2018 in the Bay Area. Eventually, I got sent to Chicago. I got sent here. I was involved in the refounding of the John Brown Anti-Crime Committee, which was initiated. Very far had a split. It was East Coast and West Coast classic. The East Coast people put the name May 19th. Something where we should have posted something very far at the name of the West Coast. Eventually, we joined and came together to refound the John Brown Anti-Crime Committee. We had the West Coast thing, well, take a stand, and I was part of. I went back to Chicago for the sort of refounding convention of John Brown. And John Brown was interesting because it took a very, very high level of politics during part of the meeting. It was a consciously, it conceived of itself as a solidarity organization with the new African independence movement. The idea that there were 5 states in the South, basically break away and be separate from the United States. And so we worked with the Republican New Africa, we worked with the Malcolm X grassroots movement, the New African People's Organization, and the hardcore people in John Brown at the beginning were people who had that ideological orientation, felt like the basis of doing anti-Klan work and anti-racist, anti-fascist had to be conscious solidarity with militant sections of the Black liberation struggle in the 17th century. Prairie Fire is interesting because it was never a party-building formation. It always it was not that it was necessarily not interested in Marxism and other stuff, but it basically saw that the United States is a settler colonial empire. There's not going to be a single party or a single revolution. There are multiple revolutionary processes going on among indigenous people, among people of African descent, Puerto Ricans and Asian people, all of whom are essentially colonized, particularly the Black people on the land base. And certainly this territory, Ron, as people said in the beginning, you recognize that this is too much, and Lomba and Peachland, and he worked with so this whole area is occupied northern Mexico, was stolen in an act of war. So that politics was a very anti-colonial politics even back then, and that is still the basics of the politics that I work on. So I you can read the book, and I'll go into it further there, but basically I think that people misunderstand fascism. I think one of the reasons there is this struggle about what is anti-fascism is that there's a struggle about what is fascism. And to me, the best definition of fascism, one of the things is there put out, which is that fascism is bringing the methods of rule of colony into the metropole. In other words, Germany carried out genocide in Namibia before they carried out genocide in Germany. And so Italy became fascist when they carried out invasions in Africa and restored the glory of the Italian Empire. But in the United States case, it was an empire, it's a separate colonial empire from day one. And so elements of what we came to call fascism have always been part of the method of rule in this country, directed primarily at colonized and indigenous people, African people of African descent, Asian people as they were imported, Mexicanos who are indigenous really, but also to create a base of support. One of the things about fascism is that it incorporates people into the state and into the ruling ideology of the party. It tries to transform the personality of people. And if you think of any place that has transformed the personality of human beings, it's the United States of America, constantly bombarding people with a sense of individualism and also, however, a collective identity of whiteness for white people. And so I think that that is a key element of fascism, that you see genocide, you see enslavement, you see experimentation, you see also, however, incorporation of people. And so, for example, the labor movement, the union labor began in California as the labor of white labor, to say, oh, buy this because it's not made for, Asians or whatever. So I think that those struggles are essential to my understanding what fascism is. And that in relation to the state, I wrote a book in 1995 called White Lies, White Power. One of the chapters looks at the relation between the state and right-wing forces. There was a contradictory relation there because a lot of the right wing does conceive itself as revolutionary or maybe sometimes anti-capitalist, but there's been a lot of collaboration. And so the FBI's role in relation to the Ku Klux Klan completely different than the FBI's role in relation to SDS or the Black Panther Party or AIM. The FBI's role in the Ku Klux Klan is basically to lift it up, infiltrate it, keep it, kind of on a short leash. And you've seen it over and over again. So I'll stop there because I think there's a lot more you want to talk about.
What I think is interesting to me when you're talking about the history of John Brown is that it is an intensely kind of political project and deeply based in anti-imperialist politics and actually kind of bridging different social movements that people today sort of see as separate. And that separation is sort of necessarily a bit of how anti-racist action saw it early on. There's 2 chapters in the book that talk a little bit about ARA besides Michael's chapter. There's one by Daryl Lamont Jenkins talking about his time in ARA. And there's an interview with my friend Mike Crenshaw, who's a founding member of ARA and the anti-racist skinhead crew, the Baldies, in Minneapolis. And the way that he often explains this is that this was really a practical effort. So they were, young punk rockers. They're going around their communities, and it's the same communities that the White Knights and the Klan were trying to organize, urban Klan, were trying to organize, and often confronting them at the same music venues, bars, things like that, down the street. So this was all practical. Like they were getting there, kicking out Nazis because they threatened them. That was it. And for a lot of them, politics came later. And, in talking to our friend, Kieran Knutson, he referred to the John Brown folks as adults. He's like, those are the grown-ups that came and told us about the politics, because that was kind of new and stuff. So I'm kind of curious about how you transitioned to doing anti-racist action work in LA. I believe that your chapter wasn't originally ARA, or was it independent from the larger network? And what was your relationship like with a lot of these younger folks that were getting involved with this right in the beginning?
Okay, yeah, I do want to say one other word actually about John Brown anti-colonialism. This is specific. The original John Brown anti-colonialism was set up by the East Coast people because it came out from prisoners they were in touch with in the New York State prison system, that many of the prison guards were active members of Klan collaborators in New York State, and the prisoners were asking for outside support to take that issue up. And so that was the launching of JBAKC. And then, that's always been an issue, both support for political prisoners and opposition to, mass incarceration as a phenomenon of white supremacy in that organizing. So I was part of, as I say, refounding the John Brown. We had chapters in many cities, but it was a very, very high level of unity. And it began to shift as it went along. People realized it was very, very hard to actually organize people necessarily into that level of politics to start. And since it was pandemic, there was a lot of Klan activity. JBAKC was involved in militant confrontations with Klan people, in Connecticut and Chicago and Los Angeles and elsewhere. We had in LA, there were 3 crosses that were burned. That would turn out to be a kind of unity rally of the white area resistance, the Aryan nations, the local KKK, the local Nazi party in Southern California, the white area resistance in San Diego, that's for the Aryan nations in Idaho. And a number of people who were busted in that ended up forming the Order, which is the white supremacy underground. But this was in the 80s. Long story short, Prairie Fire and John Brown basically left Los Angeles. It was some splits, and Prairie Fire people moved, etc., etc. I had gotten involved with someone. I had 3 stepped involved in school, and I stayed. I started doing opposition research on the right, kind of keeping track of who's doing what. I learned that J.B. Stoner, who was been one of the leaders of the Klan and was a convicted church bomber. Not anyone who built girls, but for a series of bombings of churches in Birmingham. He'd been a fugitive for a long time, and finally started with the prison, came out, and was touring the country trying to connect the Klan roots that he came out of with the nascent bonehead scene that developed in the 80s. People who were into Screwdriver, which formed that extremely right-wing version of skinheads. And so I found that his Congress speak in Glendale, and I pulled together a coalition of people who we had a counter demonstration, about 1,000 people turned out. We got the library of Kansas and wanted to have a big to do in front of the Holiday Inn, where he should schedule a room and stuff. And the Glendale police brought out a water can, and actually they didn't actually spray it, but they did declare illegal assembly. I haven't seen all that back. Moved it out. And so that was the founding of what was called PART, People Against Racist Terror. And partly I was also trying to follow from the earlier cross parties, because they eventually did bring Nestor to trial, and the slogan was across parties racist terror. So that was around the same time that a lot of the other groups that formed the ARA network were getting going. And I was putting out at that point a zine, trying to find sort of copies of the year and circulating. I would, find out what information, mail it out. Send people would send other stuff. I was older, as you say, it's the adults or whatever, but I felt like they were doing really important work. It's much more spontaneous, as you say, than what John Novick did, which was initiated by a political formation. Anti-racist action was just growing up like mushrooms everywhere, in clashes with Nazis trying to take over scenes and movement. So there's a lot of correspondence. The first actual ARA gathering took place in Portland. because of the trial of Metzger had following in a group called Eastside White Pride in Portland. He was actually brought to trial because they killed an Ethiopian immigrant who were getting Sirah. And the case was brought, a civil case against him, liability for that death. And so people gathered for that trial, and in the whole struggle was going on in Portland at that time because the Nazis were quite active. So the people from LA, San Diego, Bay Area, there were several groups that were affiliated with the network. And so originally I was using the name Park, people get registered, but eventually we took up the area name. But we were always part of the network. And they started having these conferences in the Midwest called MAFNet, which was the Midwest Anti-Fascist Network. And it morphed into anti-racist action. And I'm going to shout out here to Kristen Schwartz, who's with area Toronto and involved in a lot of that, and probably speak for herself, but some of it would be voiced to offer something. But the interesting things about ARA was that it was always an international organization. And there were chapters all over Canada, there were chapters all over the United States, into the Southeast. And then even corresponding networks, there was a group in I think Bolivia called Resistencia Redskin. And we were in touch with European forces. So that was very, very interesting. This was a global phenomenon. And for me, it was very inspiring. This is a whole new generation coming up. Especially when listening to Kristen and see a visiting from Toronto that, I stayed a good maybe. So maybe I was on the tour, kind of looking forward to come out and go to different area chapters across the area. And part of it is to go to the University of the U.S. Invasion, Puerto Rico, and DC, the particular station. But in 1998, I was 51 already. I found it legit, and so I was still going to warp tour events and stuff, and then at some point I looked around and said, well, the parents who are getting dropped off from the parents' tent are younger than my stepkids. I got other stuff going to but I kept me young and kept me connected to a militant and vibrant and important work that had to be done, and I felt like I was bringing a perspective to it. Come back to your question. From the history of John Brown, we did have at one point so colloquial between some former and that was John Brown's touchdown in the LA. But just that those ideas of solidarity with prisoners and political prisoners, particularly in the civil rights writing, the areas involved in top watches, that were really important, that it's similar to what the past. And then just the whole idea of more conscious solidarity with liberation movements and people. So for Black City, Chicago, before we did the so Canadian movement and its offshoots, its Community Council, Asian struggles. So my work here in LA has mostly been of that nature. I work with a joint indigenous Japanese group that does an annual march from Little Tokyo on the corner of Union Street, where people have gathered up for concentration camps out to Manzanar every year. I've done that to Colorado, to the Muslim Nacional as a youth camp in Sealand that are liberated at point of arms in the 80s, and they still have families that invite people to come to similar thing for youth camp. I've worked with Mountain Express people that are here with other Black formations, and I think that conscious solidarity has to be part of it. That's racist work. In terms of the ARA, it was, as I say, a cultural phenomenon that, particularly like at one point I suggested people do like Race Trader magazine with Novick, say somebody goes back to Chicago, but the people in Arizona, and interesting, but he came out to visit, came to a punk show with me, and he was floored because his idea of what punk was completely white, plastic. And the punk show here was, first of all, it had not only punk, but hip hop, musicians, Filipinos, Asians, Mexicans. It was like a completely different scene. And that, had a different flavor than, a lot of other cities, let's say, that where punk begins, they say some alienating white fans. I don't know if that.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting about kind of modern, what we think of as modern Antifa groups. I mean, first off, is that there's a direct continuity. So Rose City Antifa formed out here in Portland in 2007, formally, but it had kind of pinkered for a couple of years before that, in response to what was becoming Volksfront, was becoming this like big neo-Nazi skinhead confederation. Hammerskins and other groups were meeting here in Portland to try and settle their beefs. Neo-Nazis fight each other just as much as they fight other people. They're constantly at each other. And so they were trying to essentially orchestrate a gang truce between neo-Nazi crews, so that they could be more effective in their racist organizing. And so that's how RCA, Rose City Antifa, had formed together, and it had formed in kind of consultation and some members that were from earlier anti-racist action. But they wanted to be a couple of differences. For one, they wanted to be not completely detached from like music scenes and stuff, but they wanted to be specifically a political organization in the way that John Brown was, to think about that, to think about how they could recruit new people outside of those scenes, and also pick up on some of the lessons from places like Germany and Britain over the like decade previous. So I thought that we could, I think, take questions or comments here in a second. I thought that it'd be cool to go through a couple of modern kind of lessons learned from the past few years. I could talk for a minute and then pass it to Michael, because I'm really curious to hear what your kind of thoughts are. But I think we've seen this big upsurge of anti-fascist organizing starting in about 2016, a little bit 2015, but then definitely 2016 to now. And so I think the terrain has changed by what folks have learned then. I think for me, the biggest thing is that persistence works. So people probably followed or have attended the anti-fascist demonstrations in Portland. There was a group called Patriot Prayer, as well as the Proud Boys, Traditionalist Workers' Parties, and a few other far right groups that used to do these big mass actions in Portland and then try and hold private meetings, do recruitment meetings and things like that. And they were met by increasingly large crowds, both Black Bloc organized in coalition with Rose City Antifa, and kind of mass marches with Pop Mob and other groups, that physically shut those down. So they were not able to actually work. And that is what actually declined their size over time. And we're seeing this in likely cities around the country, that like a real persistence is what shuts down groups. This is true in Portland specifically, and like Rose City Antifa's history proves that in a way. Volksfront, that kind of confederation that was formed when Rose City Antifa was basically coming together, they shut them down by essentially being really tenacious, by going after individuals one at a time, getting them evicted from their places, kicked out of their jobs, run out of town. That destabilized the leadership so much that it actually kind of orchestrated the organization's dissolution to a degree. And this is happening all across the country in different situations. I think one of the big lessons that I've had is that as a mass movement, there needs to be a spot for everyone. And that means creating different pathways to organizing, different pathways to participation. I think there's an image, one of the problems with the narrow image of anti-fascism is that people don't see themselves in it. They think, okay, well, I can't do that. Maybe I don't feel comfortable in those physical confrontations, or maybe I can't get to these things, or whatever different things that kind of interrupt that participation. And that's on us as organizers. If we haven't created a pathway to get people involved and to find ways that useful intervention, that also means encouraging folks to organize where they're at. Like, what kind of communities are you already a part of? Where do you hold sway? Where do people trust you? Those things are important. I think one of the things that people didn't, I think, expect of the far right is that they would give up their most basic principles whenever it was opportunistic. So, for example, the Proud Boys did really open recruitment in communities of color. They wanted to have large contingents of folks of color in the Proud Boys because they thought that that would divert claims of their racism. And so they will absolutely do things like that. They'll try and recruit queer communities at the same time as they're attacking queer events. And that is something that people didn't expect, I think. And that was hard, I think, to then organize the community to say, look, this is what this group is, when we didn't kind of understand how they were operating and how they were talking out both sides of their mouth, and how they were doing these sorts of things so opportunistically. I think, one thing that's also interesting that's been really clear particularly when there are people who are ostensibly a part of the left or have been a part of like maybe an environmental movement or maybe an anti-war movement that then start creeping around with far-right groups or having kind of far-right conspiracy theories, that kind of thing, is that a person's stated politics is not the same as their actual actions. And that's also true of the far-right groups we're seeing on the ground. So a lot of times what would happen is you'd see a reporter pick up a Proud Boy and interview them, and the Proud Boy would say just totally like baseline conservative, Republican Party stuff. And it would sound really extreme. And then they say, well, why are these people out here opposing them? And they'd be like, I don't know. All I'm saying is this basic political stuff. But the reality is that they will walk away from that interview and then attack folks on the street. And so we need to actually look at what they're doing and not just let that self-definition stand. This is part of why no platforming is important. It's because they will try and talk their way out of this. At the same time, I think it's important, and we've seen a lot of kind of test cases of this, of decide smart times to when to use no platform. The final chapter in the book is by David Renton, who wrote a whole book about this, about whether or not in a particular moment to use no platforming, and when to protest, when to debate, and when to no platform. And I think figuring that out is really important, because that's about how you get buy-in from your community, if you can make the real case about it. And that kind of goes to the last thing that I had kind of jotted down, which is I think it's increasingly important to communicate with the broader public about our intentions and reasons. And I think anytime that there's been a situation in which the kind of anti-fascist movement is disconnected from the larger community, both in terms of accountability, but also just like actually explaining what's happening, why things are happening, why people should support it, that is when it goes seriously, seriously wrong. And so I think that's been, a big lesson, is that you cannot do these things just as these isolated subcultures. It has to involve everyone in the community. It has to be directly tied to the community's needs, how they want to operate, what's actually happening, and what they can contribute. I know, Michael, if you had some thoughts on this.
Recommend the book to people. It's a really, really valuable book, and a few things that that short shift list discussion. I think it really has a lot of material about Black anti-fascism, which I think is critical. People understand the whole history of that. A lot of different international contributions. There's a whole section about doing anti-fascist work inside the Black metal scene and other. It's like really, really rich work. And I mean, I learned a lot reading it. I've been doing this work for, let's say, more than 50 years. So I did want to really commend Shane for compiling that amazing, amazing work. I did want to say a couple things about ARA briefly, because ARA did transform itself over years, because it was around for quite a while. And so, originally had 4 points of unity, and to that we added opposition to homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia. As those things became evident, organizing principles for people who were combating. So, that thread of, multi intersectional organization was always a part of it. One contrast between John Brown and ARA was that John Brown was very consciously trying to promote women's leadership coming out of the left organizations that it was connected to, which were predominantly led by women, lesbians, anti-imperialists. Much more of a struggle about male supremacy inside the area over the years, and a lot of chapters fell apart over improperly handled relationships and struggles over how to deal with support for survivors, a lot of stuff like that. But we didn't go into it here, but it's, Kristen can say it. She co-authored a book recently called "We Go Where They Go: Restoring Anti-Racist Action." A lot of it is in the books and helpful here, as well as No Pasarán. I guess the other thing I'd say is that I engaged in this work because I am committed to destroying the U.S. empire and the federal state, and I see it as a separate global empire. And I do think that has to be eventually the basis of doing this work. I think the historic weakness of both anti-fascism on the one hand and anti-imperialism on the other is very often on tendencies towards class collaboration and accommodation with state forces. So a lot of anti-imperialists and sometimes the national people I see out there that will support the work with that. It's an illusion we see it play out in many national creation circles that have come to know South Africa and many other places. The same thing back in fashion, it's often doing that well. You need to ally with liberal elements of bourgeoisie who oppose the government fascists. That's deadly fatal mistake. So we have to figure out how to maintain the political independence and doing that work that brings elements of anti-imperialism, elements of anti-fascism together in a sense that it's actually leading towards a revolutionary transformation of society in its entirety. Because the appeal of fascism in this country especially, but around the world, presents itself as a different way to organize society that will actually be better for people. And you have to not be seen as supporting the society that you're in to oppose that, because the scenario over is rotten. It's horrible. So, on the one hand, you don't want to alienate people who think everything is movie except for fascists, but you have to find a way to raise that struggle and keep it lively and engage with people. So we were part, for example, here, something called Neighbors Against Nazis. After the 92 rebellion here, when the cops who beat Rodney King were acquitted on the Simi Valley, there was a group formed in Simi Valley, which is out of the Ventura County, that invited the nationalist movement and then some other right wing. They thought, oh, this is great, this is our territory. And it is true, in Simi, a lot of cops who live in LA, who work in LA, live in Simi, and maybe retired. But so we had a whole series of demonstrations out in Simi, Neighbors Against Nazis. That was part of it, but we were stimulating a much wider organization and working with the Chicano movement and indigenous people and Jewish communities and so on to try to have a much more massive thing and introducing some of these ideas in a palatable way to people. And I think that that's vital. You have to, as as Shane was saying, you have to have an inviting movement, but you have to maintain the political principle. And that it's not easily done. But and then the other thing I think I want to commend to people is I work on two newspapers over here. One is called Turning the Tide, been putting up since 1988. We send hundreds of copies reading from prisons, but the tremendous lessons from the prisons about fascism, because workplaces are pretty fascistic, schools are pretty fascistic, and prisons are extremely fascistic. And yet the prisons are able to organize under those circumstances, hunger strikes, work strikes, unification of people across racial lines. And if we can grasp how they've been doing that and apply it out here in the quote unquote free world, or minimum security, that's what I call it. But I think that there are huge lessons there, and also resistance from torture. I mean, some of the things they do, like political prison, isolation, but people said some toilet burning people, it's like the capacity to maintain a political principle under low pressure. I think it's something that is vital for our movements to pick up. Because, as Shane said, there's a lot of people who drift in and out, the left and in and left on the right, a lot of people who, get a little pressure in third states evidence, that you see it in, many environmental other circles. And I think how to internalize your political principles so that your character is solid, yourself, recognizing that everybody has struggles inside themselves. You have to see that, nobody is a paragon, but, it's always a constant sort of maintaining your commitments and maintaining your understandings and live up to them. And so that's something I try to do for, 60 some odd years now, but, it's still a struggle, you just say. And there are all kinds of tools like white supremacy and male supremacy, and, people assume I'm just funding straight away there, but not, like that. So, I guess it's not there. You can take some questions.
Yeah, I right before we have about 10 minutes or so for questions, but I just wanted to kind of highlight Michael's comment. The far right presents itself, actually Matthew Lyons talks about this in his chapter, the far right presents itself as a threat to the status quo, and will say the left actually is the status quo, and basically try and create this framework where the left actually is defenders of the state and things like that. And the reality is that we actually have to present a radical vision, acknowledge the actual crisis society is living in, and confront and threaten it. And I think that is actually the sharpest edge we can have, is become an actual threat to capitalism and the state. So yeah, I guess I'll take questions. I might not be able to hear them when someone says them. I'm not sure. So JC or Michael, you might have to repeat them when they come in.
How many questions are you taking?
However long we have. I think we only have like 10 minutes, right?
Okay.